When a lifelong people pleaser finally snaps out of the trance and starts seeing the world as it actually is, something terrifyingly beautiful happens. Most people assume that when an empath stops overgiving, they just become cold, bitter, or entirely selfish. But Carl Jung discovered a completely different reality. You don't become malicious, you become dangerous. You become an absolute threat, not to innocent bystanders, but to every manipulative relationship, toxic family dynamic, and corporate system that has quietly bankrolled its success using your endless self-sacrifice. For years, people have fed on your inability to say no. The moment you step out of that role, you break the unspoken contract that kept everyone else comfortable at the expense of your sanity. Jung called this profound psychological rebirth individuation, the process of stepping out of the collective herd and becoming a fully realized, independent human being. It is the single most disruptive thing a chronic giver can do in a society that is fundamentally engineered to exploit their kindness. To understand how this revolution begins, you have to picture the exact moment everything shifts. Imagine sitting alone in your car or on the edge of your bed after another brutally exhausting day of playing emotional referee for everyone else. You are physically empty and mentally spent because you just spent the last 12 hours managing crises that weren't yours to fix. You said yes to a favor when your entire soul was begging you to say no. You forced a polite smile through your own deep fatigue just to keep a toxic friend or a demanding coworker comfortable. Right now, your nervous system feels like it is literally on fire, trapped in a permanent state of fight or flight, because you have absorbed everyone else's chaotic energy like a sponge. But this time, something inside you fractures in a good way. Instead of doing what you always do, ignoring your own pain, swallowing the resentment, and forcing yourself to power through, you just stop. You sit in the quiet and ask a single, terrifying question that changes the entire trajectory of your life. What if I just stopped? What if I stopped saving people who refuse to save themselves? What if I let them sit in the mess they created? That tiny, quiet question is what Jung defined as the absolute birth of human consciousness. It is the moment the matrix glitches. Once you dare to look at your life through that lens, the illusion is permanently shattered, and there is absolutely no going back to the blissful ignorance of your old, compliant self. Let's strip away all the modern, fluffy spiritual terminology and talk about the raw truth that mainstream self-help gurus completely ignore. Your hyper-awareness, your deep empathy, and your uncanny ability to read the energy of a room the second you walk in is not some mystical superpower you were blessed with at birth. It is what psychologists call survival sensitivity. In plain terms, it is a sophisticated trauma response cleverly disguised as profound compassion. You didn't develop this radar because you were born an angel. You developed it as a child because you lived in an environment where it wasn't safe to be blind to the moods of the adults around you. You learned to scan faces, decode vocal tones, and anticipate emotional storms just to keep yourself safe and secure. Over time, this survival mechanism hardened into a personality trait. You became completely addicted to being needed, constantly fixing, healing, and rescuing everyone around you, because your brain learned that being useful was the only way to guarantee you wouldn't be abandoned. You traded your authentic identity for a role, believing the lie that you are only valuable if you are actively draining your own well dry to keep others hydrated. When this realization finally hits you, it is never a gentle, peaceful awakening. It doesn't feel like a warm meditation session. It feels like an absolute train wreck. Jung perfectly described this psychological crisis as a collision with the unconscious. It is a violent, shocking awakening where you are forced to look in the mirror and realize that your entire identity, your friendships, and your daily habits have been built on a monumental lie. You have to swallow the bitter pill that you were never actually required to carry the emotional weight of the world, and that you willingly let people walk all over you just to buy their temporary approval. The moment that bubble bursts, your psychological dam breaks, and your shadow self surges to the surface. For an empath, the shadow doesn't contain hidden evil desires. It contains pure, unadulterated, frozen rage. It is a massive reservoir of deep anger at every person who took your kindness for weakness, every emotional vampire who bled you dry, and every partner who watched you drown without offering a hand. This rage isn't something you should fear or suppress. It is your healthy biological boundary system trying to scream its way back to life. It is your voice demanding to be heard after years of being choked down. When you finally integrate this shadow, you undergo a massive software update. You become consciously selective. You gain a sort of psychological X-ray vision. You can spot a guilt trip from a mile away. You instantly recognize manufactured drama, and you see right through the subtle manipulation tactics that used to keep you trapped in a cycle of endless giving. You don't become a cruel or bitter person, you just become a clear one. You stop tolerating a life built on your own slow destruction, and you finally step into your true, unshakable power. The 8 signs of conscious awakening 1. The energy reversal. The very first indicator that your consciousness is shifting is a massive internal redirection of your life force. For your entire life, your energy has functioned like an open valve, constantly spraying outward to fix, soothe, and stabilize everyone around you. You walked into a room and immediately began scanning for who was anxious, who was angry, or who needed their ego stroked, unconsciously bleeding out your own vitality to balance their scales. When the awakening hits, that valve completely shuts off, and the flow reverses. Your energy begins to pool back into your own reservoir. You will notice a shocking change in your daily stamina. You no longer leave basic social interactions feeling like a hollow shell because you have subconsciously stopped absorbing the toxic moods, petty complaints, and heavy anxieties of the people around you. You become structurally insulated. The chronic, heavy exhaustion that you thought was just a permanent part of your personality begins to lift, replaced by a grounded focus on your own well-being. Most importantly, the sticky, sickening guilt that used to paralyze you whenever you even thought about protecting your space completely evaporates. You realize your energy belongs to you, and you finally have the fuel required to build your own life instead of constantly sustaining theirs. 2. The death of the mask. The second sign is the complete, irreversible disintegration of your social persona. Carl Jung spoke extensively about the persona, the psychological mask we wear to fit into society and secure love. For the unawakened empath, this mask is always the same. It's the character of the endlessly nice person, the tireless helper, the saint who never complains, and the reliable worker who absolutely never says no. You wore this mask for so long that you forgot your own face, believing that if you ever took it off, you would be rejected and abandoned. But as your awakening deepens, this mask becomes physically and mentally impossible to maintain. It starts to feel like a suffocating straitjacket. Suddenly, you find yourself speaking the raw, unvarnished truth instead of script-writing polite lies just to keep people comfortable. When someone asks for a massive favor that inconveniences you, you express your genuine preference and say no without wrapping it in a decorative bow of apologies. When you are exhausted, you openly admit it and go rest, completely refusing to pretend you have an endless supply of energy just to keep up appearances. This sudden authenticity absolutely terrifies the people who built their comfort on your self-erasure, but you simply do not care anymore. Your radical self-acceptance becomes infinitely more important to you than their shallow approval. 3. The projection recall sign number 3 is a brutal but liberating mental shift called the projection recall. Because empaths possess a massive, beautiful capacity for genuine care, deep loyalty, and emotional depth, they naturally assume that everyone else operates the exact same way. For years, you have been projecting your own golden qualities onto profoundly hollow, manipulative, or emotionally stunted people. You fell in love with their potential rather than their actual performance, spending months or years making elaborate excuses for their toxic behavior, telling yourself they were just misunderstood, stressed, or secretly hurting deep down. During a conscious awakening, this optical illusion shatters. You pull your projections back and start looking at people with cold, clinical realism. You stop listening to their empty promises and start judging them strictly on their consistent actions. You see them exactly as they are, not as you wish they were. Along with this comes a massive revelation about your past irritation. You realize that the intense disgust or resentment you felt towards selfish people wasn't actually because they were bad, but because they were doing what you desperately wished you had the courage to do. You were irritated by their boundaries because you had suppressed your own healthy selfishness for so long. 4. Sacred selfishness. As the awakening takes hold, your boundaries cease to be casual suggestions and instead become absolute, non-negotiable law. In the past, whenever you tried to set a boundary, you would deliver a frantic 20-minute monologue filled with excuses, justifications, and apologies just to soften the blow. You were essentially begging the other person for permission to protect yourself. Now you discover the absolute majesty of a simple, clean, standalone sentence. No, I can't do that. You offer zero elaborate explanations because you realize that your time and peace do not require a defense attorney. As you implement this, you will notice a fascinating psychological pattern. The only people who get violently angry or try to guilt trip you for setting a boundary are the exact people who were actively benefiting from your complete lack of them. Their anger is not proof that you are doing something wrong. It is empirical evidence that your boundary is working perfectly. You step into a state of sacred selfishness, realizing that prioritizing your own mental, physical, and emotional health isn't a malicious act. It is a fundamental, biological requirement for living an authentic life. 5. The disappearance of guilt. The 5th sign is perhaps the most shocking and immediate relief an empath can experience: the total evaporation of chronic guilt. Unawakened empaths are practically marinated in guilt. They feel guilty for having needs, guilty for taking up physical space, guilty for resting, and deeply responsible for any disappointment another person experiences. Your entire life has been weaponized against you by people who knew exactly how to pull that guilt string to get you back in line. But when you step into psychological sovereignty, that internal manipulation mechanism breaks. The next time a toxic family member, an entitled friend, or a demanding partner looks at you and says, "You've really changed," in a cold, disappointed tone, something incredible happens inside you. You no longer freeze, panic, or rush forward to comfort them or prove your loyalty. Instead, a quiet, unshakable smile hits your soul, and you think to yourself, "Yes, I absolutely have changed, and that is the entire point of this journey." You finally internalize the truth that your worth as a human being is completely independent of their emotional satisfaction or low opinions of you. 6. Authenticity over approval. Sign number 6 is a radical recalibration of your core values, where you firmly place your personal truth far above external validation. For decades, you have been a chronic shapeshifter, constantly molding your opinions, your laughter, and your expressions to match whoever was standing in front of you, just to guarantee safety and likeness. You performed emotions you didn't feel, nodded along with political or social viewpoints you despised, and laughed at terrible jokes that weren't remotely funny, all to maintain a fragile harmony. Awakening puts a violent end to this performance. You choose the discomfort of standing in your truth over the comfortable lie of fitting in, even if that choice completely costs you long-term relationships, marriages, or jobs. You stop pretending, period. This newfound backbone acts as a massive natural filtering system for your life. It functions like a high-powered magnet. It will immediately repel the users, the narcissists, and the emotional parasites who can no longer control you, while simultaneously drawing in authentic, secure, and deeply grounded individuals who respect your strength. 7. Healing the healer. The seventh sign marks the exact moment you transition from a victim of your empathy to a master of your reality. Almost every single empath on this planet starts out as a wounded healer. You have been desperately running around trying to fix, parent, and rehabilitate every broken adult in your vicinity as a subconscious coping mechanism to avoid looking at your own deep, unhealed pain. It is infinitely easier to focus on someone else's chaotic life than it is to sit quietly with your own trauma. Awakening forces a mandatory mirror in front of your face, violently turning your healing gifts inward for the very first time in your life. You completely stop parenting the fully grown adults around you, leaving them to face the natural consequences of their own choices. Instead, you turn all that massive compassion, patience, and nurturing energy toward your own inner child. You start asking yourself the foundational question you've ignored for decades. What do I actually need right now? You finally stop trying to pour water into everyone else's cups while your own well has been bone dry and cracked for years. 8. Conscious connection. The final crowning sign of this profound transformation is the achievement of what Jung called conscious relationship, or what can be practically described as bounded compassion. Reaching this stage does not mean you turn into a cold, unfeeling robot or a bitter cynic. Your deep capacity to feel for human suffering remains fully intact, but it is now paired with an ironclad shield. You gain the rare ability to deeply care about someone else's pain without foolishly taking that pain on as your own personal responsibility. You learn to love people intensely without feeling a toxic compulsion to rescue them from themselves. You can walk into a highly chaotic, emotionally charged room and read every single subtle dynamic instantly with razor-sharp accuracy. But you no longer look to that room for your validation, identity, or safety. You become completely self-contained. You attract partnerships based on mutual respect, clean communication, and equal giving, rather than the old, trauma-bonded cycles of one-sided exploitation. You look at the world from a place of supreme clarity. You see people's pain, you honor their journey, but you completely refuse to abandon yourself ever again. The moment you choose to stand in your own power, you must prepare yourself for the inevitable fallout. For years, your relationships operated under an unwritten, unspoken contract. You provide endless emotional support and unquestioning compliance, and in exchange, they grant you conditional acceptance and temporary peace. The very second you break that contract by setting a firm boundary or prioritizing your own sanity, the dynamic shatters. When you stop playing the role of the reliable, predictable emotional sponge, certain people will pack their bags and exit your life. Let let them go. Do not chase them. Do not beg them to understand your perspective, and do not compromise your growth just to lure them back into your space. Their departure isn't a tragedy. It is the trash taking itself out. You need to understand that this awakening doesn't mean you are losing your beautiful capacity to feel deeply or that your heart is turning to stone. Instead, you are evolving from a state of raw, uncontrolled vulnerability into what can only be described as conscious sensitivity. You still possess the profound gift of deep empathy, but you are no longer at its mercy. You are now the gatekeeper of your own mind. You possess the executive authority to look at an external emotional storm and choose exactly what to analyze and what to completely reject. You can care about a situation without letting it infect your peace, effectively building an ironclad shield around your soul while keeping your innate sensitivity fully intact as a superpower. To permanently maintain this state of psychological sovereignty and protect yourself from slipping back into old, draining habits, you must swear by a new set of non-negotiable rules. First, you must live by the law to feel everything, but absorb absolutely nothing. You can observe someone else's anger, anxiety, or grief with complete clarity, but you must remember that their emotions are their private property, and you have zero obligation to host their chaos inside your own body. Second, you must commit to giving exclusively from your overflow and never from your depletion. Your energy is a sacred resource, and if your own glass is empty, the answer to external demands is a hard, unapologetic no. You cannot save a drowning person if you are gasping for air yourself. Third, you must master the art of loving others without completely losing yourself in the process. True love does not require you to dissolve your identity, erase your preferences, or become a shadow of who you are just to keep someone else stable. Fourth, you must make a pact to offer help only when you are genuinely inspired to do so, and absolutely never because you feel guilty or manipulated. If an act of kindness is born out of a fear of conflict, rather than an abundance of love, it is a betrayal of your own integrity. Finally, you must ruthlessly trust your own inner knowing over any amount of external pressure. When your intuition screams that a person or a situation is toxic, you believe it instantly, even if the entire world is telling you that you are just being crazy or dramatic. These 5 principles aren't just arbitrary rules. They are your personal declaration of independence. As you begin to implement this code, you must anticipate the predictable backlash from the world around you. Society, along with the highly dependent people in your life, will quickly label your new boundaries as cold, unfeeling, or deeply uncaring. Do not let this gaslighting shake your resolve. They aren't genuinely upset because you lack compassion. They are upset because unconscious, manipulative people completely lose their power over you the absolute second you wake up. Their anger is just a desperate attempt to manipulate you back into a state of easy compliance. What they choose to call coldness is actually just healthy selfishness, which is nothing more than taking full, mature responsibility